For the first time in African Union history, the opening of the summit didn't begin with applause or formalities. It began with silence. Standing alone in the center of the hall in Addis Ababa, Captain Trayor, president of the transitional government of Burkina Faso, held a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a speech, it was a list. A list of names no one wanted to hear: victims of civil unrest, students shot during protests, mothers who had lost their children to senseless violence. As everyone turned toward him, he lifted his head and said just one sentence: "Let us begin not with words, but with silence." Then he paused. 1 minute, then 2. By the third, the silence filled the hall like fog. 24 heads of state, hundreds of diplomats, and a sea of global media are frozen. No introductions, no scripted remarks, just the weight of memory. Why would a president open a summit this way? What was he asking the continent to remember? This wasn't just a political moment. It was personal. It was history speaking. It was the future our ancestors dreamed of, one that recognizes pain before promises, one that honors truth before power. The hall itself gleamed in the midday sun, steel and glass towering over Addis Ababa. Delegates from across Africa had gathered, presidents in tailored suits, ministers with briefcases, aides whispering through translation earpieces. The African Union flag waved high, surrounded by the banners of 24 nations. This day was supposed to be about declarations, deals, diplomacy. But everything shifted the moment Captain Trayor stepped to the microphone. There was no grand entrance, no music, no ceremony. He wore a simple gray tunic, not a presidential uniform. Behind him, an aide carried just one folded piece of paper. When the mic clicked on, Trayor said again, "Let us begin not with words, but with silence." At first, people were confused. Some thought it was a technical issue. Interpreters froze, but Trayor stood still, closed his eyes, then quietly unfolded the paper and started reading. Samuel Umar, 19, shot outside Nairobi University. Fortuma Trayor, 34, disappeared near the Mopi border. Daniel Menda, 11, burned in a village. Raid Isakante, 12, died crossing the desert. Mahmoud Diarra, 70, died waiting for food. Name after name, from Kenya, from Niger, from Mali, from Burkina Faso, from Chad. Young, old men, women forgotten. Silenced, he paused after each one. Let each name settle. And slowly, the hall changed. Kenya's president, William Ruto, leaned forward, hands clasped. Rwanda's Paul Kagame took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa quietly shook his head. Even the photographers had stopped. The silence became sacred. Behind Trayor, the screen didn't show logos or flags, just candles, one for each name read. When the list ended, he didn't look at anyone. He stepped back. 7 minutes had passed. 7 minutes of silence broken only by names. No one spoke until Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, softly said, "He reminded us why we're here." The moderator tried to resume the schedule, but the room had changed. It no longer belonged to politics. It belonged to memory. Why did this matter? Because never before had an African summit opened with mourning. Never had the dead been placed before the powerful. Trayor wasn't just addressing his peers, he was gently, but firmly, calling them out. How many times have African leaders spoken of growth without naming the cost? How many lives have disappeared under the label civilian casualties? In that silence, something honest rose. Africa has been speaking, but maybe, until now, it wasn't heard. And in that moment, it wasn't just Burkina Faso speaking. It was memory, it was grief, it was a quiet plea: never forget them. It all started with a video, not the kind on the news, but one shared from phone to phone, filmed by a student. Her voice trembled as she recorded what others were too afraid to. The gates of Nairobi University, tear gas hanging in the air, riot police in black helmets, and in the chaos a boy in a red jumper, worn-out sneakers, backpack strapped tight, his eyes darting. Samuel Umar, 19. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't throwing anything. He was running, and in that blurry footage, you see it, he glances back just once, and that look says it all. Fear, confusion, the desperate hope that maybe if he turns back he'll be safe. Then he stumbles. A shot, maybe rubber, maybe not. Then another. Screams. The video cuts. In Kenya, that video spread like fire, over 2 million shares in 24 hours. But in the OAU summit, it wasn't viral, it was personal. When Captain Trayor reached his name, his voice slowed. The room was already still, but something shifted again. Even the interpreters went quiet. Samuel Umar, 19, student, Nairobi University, shot while unarmed. Kenya's delegation didn't react, but those watching closely saw it. President Ruto leaned back, his jaw tightened. His eyes stared past the ceiling. What does a president do when the name of a boy his police may have killed is read aloud, not as an accusation, but as grief? Then, without saying anything, Trayor pulled out a second paper. It was thin, handwritten, creased at the edges. His voice changed softer. "Older, my name is Miriam Wanjiku. I'm the mother of Samuel Umar. I'm not educated, but I write this so you know my son loved books. He wanted to be a teacher. He never broke a law. I gave birth to him during the rainy season. He died on dry ground. If this letter reaches someone powerful, please don't let his name disappear like dust. No one moved. No one interrupted. Trayor didn't explain. He just read her words and placed the letter beside the mic. A single candle flickered on the summit screen. It wasn't part of the official program. Trayor's team had added it quietly, one candle for Samuel. And in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't a summit anymore. It wasn't about trade, deals, or borders. It was about a mother, a boy, and a silence that had lasted far too long. What was it about Trayor's voice that made people listen? He didn't shout. He didn't perform. But in his calm, steady tone, he made it impossible to look away. One journalist later wrote that his eyes carried the weight of a continent. Maybe that's because he wasn't speaking just as a president. He was still someone's son. Still someone whose mother once wrote his name with hope. Across the room, President Cyril Ramaphosa cleaned his glasses more than once. Rwanda's foreign minister shifted in his seat, fingers tightly laced. Even the Egyptian envoy, usually composed, pressed his lips together and looked down. Samuel's name did what no briefing or policy paper ever could. It turned power into people. It turned politics into memory. And Trayor didn't need any statistics, just a letter, just a name. Isn't that what real leadership looks like? Not just big speeches, but bearing witness. Not bold visions alone, but the refusal to forget. As Trayor stepped down, he didn't wave, he didn't bow. He simply left the letter on the podium, in full view. No one clapped. No one had to. That night in Nairobi, over 300 students gathered at the gate where Samuel was killed. They brought candles. They printed and laminated copies of the letter. They stood in silence, forming a circle of light. No chants, no slogans, just remembrance. Before the next speaker approached the mic, something moved through the room. Not from the presidents or ministers, but from the aides, the translators, even the camera crew. Something had changed. At the center of the front row, where Kenya's cultural envoy had been scheduled to sit, there was now an empty chair. Draped over the back was a folded white cloth. On the seat, a small placard with just 2 words. Samuel Umar. No announcement had been made. No explanation. But there it was, a chair that wasn't for protocol anymore. It had become something else. A quiet memorial. Maybe a rebuke. Maybe a plea. Captain Trayor hadn't planned to explain it. But when he stepped up again, all eyes turned to him. He gave a small nod toward the chair and said, "Symbols speak where politics fall silent." Then the lights dimmed. The screens behind him came to life, not with flags or talking points, but with a satellite view of Africa. Slowly, red markers started to blink across the map, one by one. Each one marked a site of violence, civilian deaths, mass graves, massacres, never resolved. The markers appeared: Mogadishu, Maradi, Ohiga. Dozens, then hundreds. Within 90 seconds, the map glowed with red. "This is not a threat map," Trayor said. "This is a map of silence." Why hadn't any summit shown this before? Why hadn't any president walked delegates through a geography soaked in grief? And why did so many of these blinking dots overlap with Africa's richest regions? Gold, oil, cobalt. Who profits when civilians vanish and no one counts them? The screen faded to black. Then new images appeared. One, a white flag hanging above a school in Timbuktu. Rows of candles under a statue in Yaoundé. A child's crayon drawing stick figures holding hands taped to a bullet-ridden wall in eastern Congo. All of it real. All within the last 6 months. None of it had made the news. Trayor spoke again. "Not all symbols are chosen. Some are born because words failed us first." In the gallery above the hall, aides began placing objects around the room. A black cloth stretched across the main entrance. A banner in Swahili that read, "We now tembea katika kimya," those who walk in silence. A small glass box holding a single school shoe. No one told the cameras to zoom in, but they did, slowly, carefully. Then Trayor stepped down again. No applause followed, but the stillness this time had meaning. It wasn't just quiet, it was full. Why do objects speak more clearly than ministers? Why do we remember a child's shoe, but forget entire policy statements? And when symbols feel more honest than speeches, what does that say about the way we lead? A delegate from Senegal stood up. He crossed the floor and placed a single white flower on the empty chair. Then one from Namibia, then Gabon, one by one. No script, no signal, just quiet action. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was turning into a ritual. Later, the official broadcast noted that 17 delegates had placed tributes on the chair, marked for Samuel, but off camera, more came. Quietly, without fanfare. As if the chair had become something else, entirely a place to grieve, to confess, to remember. Across homes on the continent, people paused. Some cried. Others just stared at the screen, unable to look away. On Facebook, the image of the map filled with red markers was shared 2.8 million times in one day. A teacher in Kampala wrote, "We used to teach maps for borders. Trayor gave us maps for grief." No one knows who said it first, but by the end of the session, a quiet phrase was passing through the chamber like a prayer. He made us see. Even after the summit ended, the symbols stayed behind. A white flag flew over the African Union gate. The next morning, 3 ambassadors returned to their countries, carrying replicas of the empty chair. In Johannesburg, schoolchildren started making banners that read, "We sit for those who cannot stand." As the live stream faded to black, the last image shown was that flickering chair, and beneath it, a line of text. "If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments." The hall was still heavy with meaning when Captain Trayor returned to the podium, but this time, he held something different. A story, not a letter, a document. 42 pages, bound in grey, embossed with the seal of the African Union. He raised it briefly so the room could see the title catch the light. "This," he said, "is not just a policy. It is a promise." Silence again. But this time, it leaned forward. The title read Continental Principles for Civilian Protection. It had been drafted quietly over 6 months, shaped by legal scholars, human rights workers and survivors. Today, it was moving from idea to action. Trayor didn't read from it. He didn't explain it. He walked to the center of the chamber and placed it on the circular glass table that had been empty all day. Then he looked up and said, "I won't ask you to speak. I'll only ask you to stand if you believe civilians should never die for the sake of power." It wasn't planned, it wasn't expected. At first, nothing. Then slowly, President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana stood. He walked forward, silent, and signed. No applause, just the soft sound of a pen touching paper. Then President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, then the Vice President of Angola, then ministers from Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, Sudan, one after another, not by protocol, but by conviction. What did it mean? This moment, a continent once divided by colonial borders and old rivalries coming together not from fear, but from conscience. Trayor stayed still. His name wasn't first or second. He waited until 14 leaders had signed. Then, quietly, he walked forward and added his own. This time, the cameras didn't capture confrontation or politics. They captured signatures. They captured agreement. That night, news outlets across Africa led with one story. CNN Africa called it Captain Ibrahim's Pact for the People. BBC Afrique streamed the moment in full. On the ticker below, Burkina Faso news leadership by silence. Has any treaty ever begun with mourning and ended with such clarity? Why did it take so long? To write a truth this simple, no political goal is worth the death of a child. In Accra, church bells rang. In Bissau, a mural appeared overnight, Trayor's silhouette beside the words, "We signed for peace." Even in Bamako, where tensions still simmer, students held signs that read, "Our leaders finally spoke." By midnight, 33 of the 55 OAU member states had signed. But this wasn't just politics, it was personal. One delegate from Chad whispered before signing, "This is for my niece." The next morning, the East African published an editorial. We watched a page turn not of a document, but of a generation. Still, Trayor never claimed credit. In an interview with Radio France Internationale, he said only this: "If all we did was write our conscience down and promise to keep it, then we did what was long overdue." Did those signatures fix everything? No, but they broke something. They broke the cycle of delay, of excuses, of pretending it wasn't happening. In that room, before that table, power bent not from weakness, but from memory. And for once, the headlines weren't about scandal, they were about dignity. A mother in Burkina Faso texted her sister in Senegal, "Did you see the news? They signed for us." A journalist in Nigeria wrote, "This wasn't a press release. This was a continent remembering its children." At the edge of the summit stage, under the African Union emblem, one placard that had read "Reserved" now bore a handwritten label, "Promised." And in the dry heat of eastern Ouagadougou, a bell rang for the first time. Not for a meeting, not for a military ceremony, but for a school, modest, built from red brick and quiet determination. It stood between two mango trees, a sign above the gate, Samuel Umar Memorial School for the boy who read. Children lined up, uniforms mismatched but tidy. Notebooks clutched to their chests like treasure. A few looked nervously at the bell. Most looked at him, Captain Ibrahim Trayor. He didn't stand on a podium, he stood on the same red clay they did. He didn't speak. He stepped aside so a small girl could pull the bell rope. One chime, then another. The sound floated up, soft but clear. For a moment, it sounded like more than a bell. It sounded like a continent exhaling. Why build a school for one boy? Why name a future after a life lost? Because remembering is resistance. Because no bullet should silence a book. 2 weeks later, the world gathered again, this time in New York, at the United Nations General Assembly. Delegations checked microphones. Reporters aimed cameras. The African Union entered, 21 members strong, led by Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. The moderator gestured for them to begin. They didn't. Instead, they stood. And for 2 full minutes, they said nothing. No opening speech, no policy statement, just silence. The cameras zoomed in. The room buzzed quietly. Still, they stood. Was it protest, mourning, diplomacy? Finally, Ghana's ambassador stepped forward. Her voice was quiet. "This is not absence. This is what memory looks like when it refuses to fade." They called it the silence of nations. The image spread across screens around the world, glowing behind the African delegation. Each flame stood for a name not spoken aloud, not just Samuel, but Fatuma, Daniel, Issatou, Muhammad, all of them. all of us. Could silence speak louder than a speech? Could dignity echo longer than any declaration? The footage reached over 60 million views in just 4 days. CNN's headline read, "Captain Ibrahim, the soldier who taught leaders to listen." Right beneath it, Burkina Faso from dust to doctrine. In Dakar, a mural of Samuel appeared on the wall of a primary school. In Kampala, students began their school day with a minute of silence. In Johannesburg, a city council meeting opened with 7 words, "For those we failed to protect." And through it all, Captain Trayor said nothing. No press conference, no victory post, no statement. Weeks later, a BBC reporter found him standing outside the school in Ouagadougou. Children played nearby. Laughter floated through the dusty air. The reporter asked, "Do you think any of this has changed Africa?" Trayor looked at the school, then at the children, then at the camera. He didn't answer. He didn't need to, because real leadership isn't measured by applause or camera time. It's measured by who carries the quiet burdens when no one's watching. Sometimes the most powerful things are spoken not with words, but with eyes, and in that gaze, there was no pride, no sadness, just a quiet certainty that something had shifted, not in the headlines, but in the soul of a people. Outside the frame, the laughter went on. Small, joyful, ordinary. Children ran under mango trees, chasing each other through dust and possibility. They didn't know about treaties or resolutions, but they knew safety, they knew books, they knew Samuel's name. And as the segment closed, the camera didn't pan to a flag or a face. It slowly faded to candlelight. 1 flame, then 3, then dozens trembling in the dark, not because they feared going out, but because even the softest light can stand against centuries of silence. And if we still believe Africa deserves peace that remembers, laws that protect, and futures that offer more than survival, then maybe, just maybe, that flame was never meant to fade. It all began with silence, not a pause, not a formality, but a rupture, a moment when the continent chose stillness instead of slogans, memory instead of performance. From one sentence, "Let us begin," not with words but with silence, the entire room changed, a summit reshaped, a continent that, maybe for the first time, listened to its own pain. What followed wasn't noise, it was meaning. A list of names read not for politics, but for truth. An empty chair heavier than any speech, a map of grief, a school born from loss, a treaty written in ink, but born in mourning. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Addis Ababa to New York, the silence moved, not as absence, but as answer. Because when Trayor stood at that podium in a plain gray uniform, he wasn't asking for applause, he was asking us to feel. And when the bell rang in Burkina Faso, when the candles flickered behind the UN podium, something shifted, not in newsrooms, in hearts. Can silence be Africa's loudest cry for justice? What name do you carry in your heart? What story has your family never stopped telling? Share it, let the world know we remember. Let the silence become a chorus. Drop a comment that says, "Rise, Africa." Let them know we're still here. Let them know we never left. And if this story moved something inside you, don't scroll past like, share, speak, subscribe, because they buried our history long enough now. Let's speak our future out loud. And if you're reading this, know this story doesn't end here. It lives on. In the quiet choices we make, in the conversations we start, in the names we refuse to forget, in the history we choose to carry forward. History isn't finished, it's waiting for you.